Hi, my name is Kerry Critchlow from RCR Recording Studios, and today we're going to be talking about compression. Now, we're only going to be covering the basics. This is not meant to be comprehensive by any means, but I want to give you just a little bit of background on what compression is, how it works, and how you can practically apply it to your own productions, to add vibe or character to your tracks. This is not meant to be a mixing tutorial. This is simply just going over the bare bones basics of how you can sort of practically apply some of these techniques to your own productions. And it's meant to give you more of kind of some creative ideas more than, this is how you use a compressor and this is the, the gospel according to Kerry on how to mix, and these are the settings you have to have, blah blah blah. That's not what this is all about. Just trying to give you some creative ideas on how to use compression and maybe demystify it a little bit. Compression is, or at least for me, was one of the more mystifying components of audio, and it can be a little confusing to people who don't know how to use it, and so maybe this will demystify it to a degree. But we'll get into it. So what is a compression, or what is compression? What does it do? It is just a tool to control dynamics. And dynamics is essentially the difference between loud and quiet parts. And so a compressor is used to minimize the difference or maintain a more stable volume level throughout the track or instrument that you happen to apply the compressor on. And it does this by automatically turning down the volume. It's pretty much it's that simple. A compressor just looks at the instrument info. If it's a vocal, a drum set, a guitar, or what have you, it looks at the volume of that track, and it automatically turns down that volume when it gets too loud. And that has the effect of making the loud parts quieter and the quiet parts louder. And it does this through four main controls. There's more to compression than this, but these are the four basic controls. You have your threshold, your ratio, your attack, and your release. Now, we'll get into what each of these does, not into a lot of detail, but we'll cover the basics, at least to the point where you can kind of see how this is starting to come all together. I'm sorry, I cannot talk today. It's been a week. We're just coming off of Thanksgiving weekend, and my brain has turned to mush. Apparently, I had too much relaxation. I hope you all had a great Thanksgiving yourselves, and had a lot to be thankful for. So, anyways, let's kind of jump into it. We'll go into our DAW here, and let's go ahead and create a drum track. And we'll kind of get into the practical applications of how this all works. So we'll come into our drums here, and we'll just kind of pick a random kit here. Sure, why not? And then we'll go ahead and program in a simple beat. This should all be old hat for those of you who've been following this series since the beginning. So first you need to find the sounds that you want. And in this case, we are going to look for a hi-hat here. There's some fun little sounds in this kit. I might have to keep this in mind for later. And we'll just bring this kick here, just so I can see everything on the screen at one time. Do an eighth note pattern on the hi-hat, bring down every other, as we've looked at before. Did I just delete everything? What happened? Apparently I did. Oh, no. I just went too far. Anyways, so we should have turned down, but we didn't. So, all right, yeah. Sorry about that. I just skipped ahead and I didn't realize it. So we've turned down every other hi-hat. Again, this should all be kind of just review for those of you who've been following along. Make a pretty simple pattern here. Maybe I do want to have this down here. No. Sorry, this is a little chaotic today. Okay. So something like that will be fine. Maybe turn this down a little bit. And this is where you can have some fun with your drum productions. I'm just having some fun with these sounds. Okay. And we'll just copy paste that. And I just don't want to get too far lost into the weeds here. I could play with this kind of stuff all day. This is what I love about music, is just experimenting and seeing what kind of sounds you can do and what kind of grooves you can make with this stuff. And it can be a fun world of exploration. Okay, so that'll do for today. We'll give that a loop. And then let's see what compression does to these drums. Not crumbs, drums. Man, I really am struggling today. Okay. So we're just going to go ahead and put a stock compressor on here. And when I say stock, this is just the compressor that came with the DAW. Any DAW you get will have its own kind of tools that it comes with, where you don't have to go out and buy extra third-party plugins and stuff. This is just what came with the DAW. Like, this is just included, and it's very simple and very straightforward. Now, we're not going to go over everything that you see in this here. Not all compressors have every function that you see or all the options here, but most compressors have 4 basic components, and those are the ones that we really want to pay attention to today. The first is the threshold, and the threshold is basically if we play this drum track, you'll see these meters going up. This threshold you can think of as a ceiling, and and anything that goes above this ceiling, that's when the compression will actually start. Now, no compression is going to happen because we haven't set up anything else. We have a ratio of 1, and if you have a ratio of 1, that means no compression is happening. But I want to just show you a visual aid of what's happening here with the threshold. So you see it's peaking around here, and so if we set the threshold to where it's peaking, that's when the compression will start. If you have your threshold set too high, no compression will happen. So you have to set the threshold below where the peaks are, or at the peaks, in order to have the compression even happen at all. So that's just something to bear in mind. That is something that would have been very useful when I first started getting into compression, because I didn't know any of this, and I thought I was doing compression when I actually wasn't, because I didn't have my thresholds or ratios or anything else set properly. And so hopefully this is this is a pretty basic concept here that went completely over my head when I first got into this. So hopefully it doesn't for you. So we will set our threshold kind of arbitrarily right now, just kind of around where the peak is. All right. And so the threshold is the volume setting. So anything that goes above this threshold is what the compressor is going to turn down. And so you can have the threshold all the way down here if you want, like, you know, it to be turning down the volume all the time, nonstop, or you can have it set somewhere more moderate. This is all going to make sense here in a little bit, but these are the basic controls. So the threshold is at the point at which the compressor starts turning things down. Next is the ratio, and that is how much the compression is going to turn things down by. And so the ratio basically says that for every 1 dB that it goes above the threshold, the compressor will turn it down by 1. So no compression is happening with a 1-to-1 ratio. At a 2-to-1 ratio, it's saying that for every 2 dB that the volume goes above the threshold, it will turn down the volume by 1. So if it goes above by 4, it turns down the volume down by 2. If it goes up by 3, it turns the volume down by 1.5. I hope this is all making sense. If you have a ratio of 3-to-1, it says that if the volume goes above this threshold by 3 dB, it will only allow 1 dB of volume to be outputted. And so if it goes above, so in order for 2 dB of volume to be outputted, it would have to go above the threshold by 6 dB. This could be very confusing, and I apologize. There are probably better ways to explain how ratio works, but you can think of it as the higher the ratio, the more compression you're getting, the harder it's going to turn down that volume. Okay, so moderate ratios or subtle ratios tend to be subtle to moderate, tend to be somewhere between 2 to 4 dB. Anything over 4 dB, 4-to-1 ratios tends to be, I guess, pretty moderate or hard. And anything above 10 tends to be considered like hard, or limiting ratios. And so this will all make sense the more you kind of get into it. But basically, all the ratio is saying that with a 4-to-1 ratio, and it's always x to 1. The output is always 1. It's only this left number that will change. So with a 4-to-1 ratio, it's saying that for every 4 dB that the volume goes up, it will output 1 dB of volume. So you're turning the volume down by, I don't know, 75%. If my math is right, it's probably not. Math has never been my strong suit, and it's probably why ratios can be a little challenging. But the short answer for ratio is the higher the ratio, the more you're turning down that volume, okay? And that's the basic idea behind compression. When it comes to attack, that is how much time you allow to pass before the compressor turns on. And so Right now, it just as a default sets to 15 millisecond attack, which means that it's the compressor is going to wait 15 milliseconds before it starts compressing, and that's going to allow some of the initial volume or the initial sound to take place before the volume turns down. And we'll get into why this is important here in a little bit. I'm just kind of explaining the basic controls here. Excuse me. The release is how long the compressor is going to stay on before it turns off, essentially, or lets the volume go back to normal. Now, again, a compressor is to control the volume of your sound source. So right now we're controlling how loud or quiet the drums are. The important thing to remember about attack is the more attack you allow, the louder the initial impact of the sound is going to be. And so it might sound a little bit more oomphy, a little bit more aggressive, a little more impactful. And the shorter you have your attack time, the more clipped or the more soft, I guess, it's going to sound, the more compressed it's going to sound. And for the release, the shorter you have your release, the more explosive it's going to sound, because it's going to allow the normalization, or like allow the volume to come back very quickly, and so you kind of get almost like an explosive sound. And the longer you have your release, the smoother, the more confined, the more controlled it's going to sound. So fast attack, softer, quieter, more clipped, more compressed. Longer attack, more impactful, more punchy, more in your face. And then with release, a short release is going to have more explosiveness, more power to it, more excitement. And the further and the longer your release, the smoother, the more contained, the more controlled it's going to. Smooth might be a word. These are all kind of weird adjectives, I know, but those are the basics. So we'll say threshold is when compression happens. The ratio is how much the volume gets turned down. And attack is going to be how long before compression happens. And release is when compression stops. And as a caveat here under attack, we'll just say fast attack is going to seem softer, more clipped, more compressed. And a slow attack is going to be punchier, more impactful, and more in your face. And with release, a fast release is going to seem explosive, boomy, exciting, aggressive. And a slow release is going to sound more smooth, contained, controlled. Yeah, I didn't think I spelled that right. Okay. All right, so I'm hoping this all makes sense. So the threshold is at what point the compression happens. The ratio is how much the volume is going to get turned down, how much compression is happening, you can say. The attack is how long before the compression actually happens. The release is when the compression stops. And then just general kind of adjectives to describe what a fast or a slow attack is, or a fast or a slow release is. These are some adjectives that kind of come to my mind when I'm thinking about that kind of thing. So for a fast attack, it's going to be softer, more clipped, more compressed, kind of more chill. A slow and then a slow attack is going to have a punchier, more impactful, more in-your-face kind of thing. A fast release is going to be explosive, boomy, and exciting and aggressive, and a slow release is smooth, contained, and controlled. So you almost see with the attack and release that they almost are inverse. So a fast attack is going to get more soft, clipped, compressed, more controlled, but a slow release is going to give kind of similar results, whereas a slow attack is going to have the punchier, more impactful in your face, and the fast release is going to have that more explosive, boomy, exciting, aggressive. And so there's kind of an inverse happening. The faster the attack, a fast attack is kind of like a slow release, and a slow attack is kind of like a fast release. And so those are just some things to be aware of when you're dialing in your compression settings. And we'll go over some practical examples of that here. So why don't we go ahead and start compressing these drums? And we're going to start off with just these default settings here. This is kind of like where the compressor starts at. It's an attack of 15 milliseconds and a release of 200 milliseconds. And then we'll see what happens when we bring this threshold down to meet that thing. And we'll start at a ratio of 4:1 for now. And then over here, this is how much the volume is being turned down by. It's our gain reduction, GR. That stands for gain reduction. This is just telling you how much the volume is being turned down by this compressor. And right now it's being turned down by 6.8 decibels. And that's where we're going to use this gain or makeup gain or makeup volume or whatever you want to call it. This is going to be used to bring the volume back up to kind of a normal level. And so if it's being turned down by 6.8 dB, then a good place to start would be to turn this gain back up by about 6 dB. And one thing about compression is it's very easy to fool yourself by volume. If you turn this gain up, you can fool yourself into thinking that the compressor is doing something that maybe it's not. And so a good way to check that that you kind of have your output gain set correctly is to just turn off the compressor and turn it back on and see how much of a volume difference there is between when the compressor is on or off. So we're going to turn the compressor off for now. We're going to play the track, and then I'm going to turn the compressor on, and I'm just going to gauge to see how much louder or how much quieter the track is with the compressor on or off, and then I may adjust this gain to compensate to make sure that it sounds roughly, give or take, about as loud with the compressor on or off. Okay, so roughly about 5 dB of makeup gain seems to be appropriate as far as I can tell. And so you can kind of hear what the compressor is doing. When it's on, everything seems to be much more tight, much more together, if you will. some of the snare hits and kick hits seem to be a little bit more in your face. There's a little bit of punchiness, and that's because we have this fast attack going. But the drums also seem to be somewhat contained, smooth, and kind of chill because we have a relatively fast release happening here, or a relatively slow release, sorry. So let's go ahead and decrease this attack or release. Let's shorten it to like a 50 millisecond here, and you're going to see that the drums might sound a little bit more aggressive than they did. And you also see we're getting less game reduction when we play with these settings. So when you make changes to the attack, the release, the ratio, the threshold, you may also have to make adjustments with this makeup gain in order to keep the relative volumes the same. So if we turn this off, now it sounds way louder with the makeup gain at that. So let's turn the makeup gain down a little bit and see if that's a little bit more dialed in. Okay, so yeah, you're kind of seeing what happens. Let's go a fast attack now and fast release. And now this is, the gain reduction is turning the volume down a lot more because we're not allowing any of the initial transients or initial kind of sound of the drums come through. We're kind of compressing it immediately as soon as it goes over this threshold. And so it's kind of sounds a little bit more clipped, but because we have this fast release, it's letting go of the compression pretty quickly as well. And you're getting almost like a distorted kind of vibe coming out of these drums. And we also need to make up the gain a little bit more because we're getting way more gain reduction. And we've got our threshold set pretty low as well. And so you can kind of start to see what happens when you play with some of these settings. We can also turn up the ratio a little bit, maybe go to like a more aggressive ratio. So we're really turning down the volume when this happens. And so you can add some vibe with this compressor, depending on how you have these settings. So if we really want to give it some like some in-your-face punch, we can slow down this attack a little bit and really let some of those initial transients come through before the compressor starts hitting. But we're also letting the volume go back to normal really quickly, and so we're getting a little bit of that. We're retaining that explosiveness. All right. And then we can also have this fast attack going and then a fast release. Now, with a fast attack, it's going to be more softer, more controlled, more contained. And with a slow release, it's also going to be controlled and contained and all that kind of stuff too, right? And so this is kind of like making these drums much more quiet. So it's kind of the opposite effect of what we were just listening to. And then, you know, you can use this threshold to to kind of lessen that effect if you want, or increase it. So you can do very extreme or very subtle with compression, just like EQ from last week. You can dial anywhere from extreme to subtle, and go for that kind of creative effect. And so this is just, again, compression is a tool to control the dynamics, but you can also use it to add vibe, and give your drums a little bit of character, if you will, in order to get them to either pop more or less, or sound more in your face or less in your face, whatever the case may be. You can hear the difference a little bit as I kind of shuffle this release from a slow release to a fast release. It gets kind of more contained, more controlled, and then the faster it is, the more explosive and kind of punchy you kind of starts the kind of explosive it starts to sound. Now you're hearing it mostly in the kick and the snare because those are the louder instruments that are kind of popping through. But with this with the slower release, the kick and the snare almost seem to get pushed back a little bit, and not be so much in your face. They seem to be a little bit more further back, quieter, really. And then when I go to a fast release, they seem to kind of pop out at you a little bit. Now, this might take a little bit of practice to train your ears to actually kind of hear some of this. To me, it sounds pretty obvious, but for some of you, you may not hear it exactly what this compressor is doing. But to my ears, the slower this is, the further back, or the quieter the kick and the snare sound, and the faster this release, the louder and more in your face they sound to me. So we'll listen one more time with the slow release, and listen especially for the kick and the snare here. Yeah, they just really pop out at you with this faster release. Now, and conversely, if we were to go to, we'll bring this attack back into pretty quick here, or pretty fast, and then we'll do the same thing, where we're going to keep this release maybe around 100 milliseconds, and then we're going to start with the attack at as a fast attack, and then we're going to lengthen it, and we'll hear what the difference is there. So fast attack, slow attack. Yeah, same thing. With the slow attack, the kick and the snare really seem to be pushed back a little bit, and the volume of them gets much quieter. And then when we go to a slow attack, they really seem to pop out and be much more in your face. And so these are some of the tools that you can use in order to dial in some vibe with your drums. And this can work with, acoustic drums as well. Why don't we go ahead and just do a quick look at that? Excuse me. I mean, this works with all instruments, but I want to give you kind of some examples. That's more of an electronic-y kind of drum kit. Let's look at what happens when we apply a similar thing to, say, a more acoustic sounding kit here. And so we'll go ahead and do a similar kind of thing. All right. All right, and so now we have more of an acoustic-y drum kit here. Doing a similar type of thing. Obviously, they're not one for one, but it's a similar type of beat to what these electronic-y drums are sounding like. And then we'll also work on compression. Now, because this is a different sound source, this threshold is going to be different. These acoustic drums sound a little bit quieter out of the box than these electronic ones do. And so anytime you're putting a compressor on something, you're going to want to look at this threshold, see where it's peaking, and dial in the threshold to taste. There's no right or wrong here. If you want extreme compression, you can dial it all the way down. If you want subtle, you can have it a little bit further up. But just something to be aware of is that depending on the sound source, this threshold is going to have to be set to a different spot to capture where the peaks are happening. Yeah, and automatically it's way louder. And then we've got that real slow attack, which is allowing the snare and stuff to pop through. We're not getting as much gain reduction here. All right, and then maybe a fast attack here. And I'm doing kind of extreme settings here again on this compressor, and there's nothing wrong with the extreme settings. Go ahead and use them. Whatever it is that you need to do to get the vibe you want from your drums. I'm just using extreme settings so you can really hear what the compressor is doing, but you can dial this in much more subtle if you want. Let's phase that out one more time. And so really the compressor is only hitting on the snare drum. It's the only time it's really turning on with these settings. And so when you hear the snare, that's kind of when you see this peak reduction happening. And the more we bring down this threshold, the closer maybe that the kick and the snare and the everything is going to sound in volume. Right, and so it sounds a little bit more even. Now, if we bring this attack in a little bit, so without compression. You can really hear the ring of that snare go, wow, wow, kind of get that explosiveness going on with this fast release. And the impact is happening as well from the kick and the snare because we have this, a little bit of a a slow attack here happening. And if we were to take this and slow the release down, you really hear that, like how it kind of seems much more squashed. Everything's a little bit more quiet, a little more contained, a little more controlled. Yeah, and so with a fast attack and a slow release, the kick and the snare really seem to be pushed to the background a little bit, much more quieter in volume relative to where they are by themselves here. So without the compressor. And we're getting a lot of gain protection. Again, I'm using relatively pretty extreme settings here, so. And then the more we let this attack out, the more that snare really pops out at you. And that's probably because with this particular drum kit, the snare is a lot more punchy, a lot more in your face than the kick. So like oftentimes when you're doing drums, you're going to have the kick on its own track that you can compress individually, the snare on its own track that you can compress individually, etc. But you can also, have them all on one track and get some interesting results with this compression. And so you can play around with these settings and see how it affects the vibe of the drums and, whether or not that's kind of what you want to do. You can go super extreme with it. And with this setting, extreme, it almost seems like the hi-hat disappears at times, and it's really just the snare and the kick that are coming through. And with this, you're almost getting some like distorted sound coming out. So you can actually use compression to distort the drums or your sound source or whatever if you want to really give it that kind of like grimy vibe. Yeah, so you can have a lot of fun with compressors. You can use it to give vibe. You can use it to just kind of dial in some subtle control over the elements, whatever it is you're trying to do. But like in this context, we're really going for more of the vibey context. So like if you really want to give your drums some grit, you can use this trick to like really give it some. right? Or if you want to have more punch. You can really hear that snare jumping out and grabbing you. So anyways, these are some examples of compression and how you can use them to add some vibe and some character to what you're trying to do here. Yeah, same thing with these electronic drums. You can really, give them some distortion, some grit by doing this fast attack, fast release, and really hammer them and give them that kind of vibe, right? And you can hear every now and then, like, one of the elements will really pop out at you. And so, like, these are just some kind of extreme examples, but you can get some really cool results by using compression on your drums and give them some vibe that way. And you can also, like I said, do individual instruments as well. So with the drums, you can just do the kick, or just do the snare, or just do the overheads, or just do the room, or whatever. And you get some really cool results doing it. That you're playing with compression in those regards. Again, like I said last week when we were talking about EQ, let the mixing engineer worry about the proper compression when it comes to balancing things after you've kind of had fun and given them your vibe, right? There's nothing wrong with going for these fun little compression techniques while you're doing your productions, and then let the mixing engineer worry about how to take what you've done and fit that into the context of the mix later. And because the mixing engineer is also going to use EQ and compression very heavily. They're the two main heavy lifting tools when it comes to doing mixing and shaping sounds and things like that. So when you start combining EQ and compression, you can also get some fun little results because compressors react to low-end information more than they do high-end information. So like if we were to, say, throw an EQ on here, and where you have your EQ and compression, again, you can play around with it. I think we went over that with signal flow, where you have your EQ versus your compression can matter to the sound. But if we were to throw, say, a lot of this low-end information into the compressor is going to have to work a lot harder because it's hearing that low-end information more than it would this upper frequency. So you get more compression that way. All right. So you can use EQ and compression together in tandem to really come up with some fun stuff. And where you have the EQ and compression in the chain also matters. So don't be afraid to experiment with this kind of stuff. Once you've got the EQ kind of vibing, you can throw a compressor on there, or you can throw a compressor on there and then EQ it, or you can throw a compressor on. Like, play around with it. Compression and EQ can work together in very interesting ways. For instance, if we push up this high end a lot, and then the compressor is hitting it, it'll push that volume down more than it is some of this other volume, and it'll even it out a little bit. And so, yeah, I don't know if this is making any sense, but you can really start to have some fun with the interactions between EQ and compression to really shape the sound of what you're trying to do here. Anyways, don't be afraid to play around with it. And then I guess one last little thing that maybe we can look at is just so that you can kind of get an example is to look at a different sound source here. But like again, compression is just automatically kind of turning the volume down on things, but you can use it for vibe as well. So if we were to, for instance, I don't know, maybe make a piano track again, just so you can kind of hear what compression does on different sound sources. Drums are not the only thing that you can compress. We'll just do a little E minor thing here. All right, pretty basic, but you can kind of see what's going on here. And then we'll throw a compressor on the keyboard here. And again, with that fast attack, fast release, you can really kind of push this and get it to get a little distorty here if you wanted to. If that's a vibe you wanted to go for, you can also do some more subtle things. You can have it kind of be a little punchier with a fast, slow attack and a fast release. Or you can do fast attack, slow release. Okay, and so you can play around with this kind of stuff to add vibe or kind of just control things. Like for instance, another thing that compression can be used for is to even out a a performance. So if we look at this MIDI, no piano player is ever going to hit every single note exactly the same volume like this. So what we're going to do is come through here and just make a few little adjustments here. And I have no idea if this is going to sound realistic or not, but I want to show you that some of these hits are going to be a little louder, some of them are going to be a little quieter. And so what a compressor can also do, and probably its kind of main function for its existence, at least in the beginning, before adding vibe and stuff like that, was to even out some of this type of performance, right? So you see that some of this stuff is a little louder, some of it's a little bit quieter. So if we have that piano going no compression here, so you can hear some notes are a little quieter, some notes are a little louder, right? So a compressor will take that and make that a little bit more even. So if you're maybe not the best piano player like me, and when you're playing piano, you're getting a lot of these little, dips and peaks when it comes to the volume as you're playing, you can use a compressor to kind of help even some of this out and make your performance sound a little bit more even. So listen to this, just this first bar here, right? It's loud and then it gets real quiet here, right? So if we turn this compressor on, it's not perfect, but it's evening out the volume a little bit more, especially if we were to, have a more moderate sort of setting here. Right, so we just kind of even things out a little bit. So there's a lot of different functions for what you can use the compressor for, and it's going to make some of this stuff a little bit more even and a little bit more together, glued together a little bit. So you can use it not only to add vibe, but you can also use it to control the actual dynamics of the track as it goes, and make some of these quieter parts a little bit louder, and some of these louder parts a little bit quieter. Now they're still going to poke out a little bit, and that's fine. But like it's making this a little bit just closer together in volume. And it'll make it a little bit easier to hear in the context of everything playing together. So like without this compressor, some of those notes get a little bit lost, but with the compressor, And I don't know, you may not be hearing this, but to me, it feels like some of these notes are a little bit easier to hear with this compressor on than they were with the compressor off. So off. So a little bit easier to hear when the compressor is on, some of those softer notes. And so there are a few different functions that compression can serve when it comes to your productions. You can use it to add vibe to your instruments and get them to either sound more in your face, more explosive, more aggressive, or kind of more controlled, contained, pushed back, depending on how you have your attacks and releases set up. You can have you can use it to help even out a performance. In this case, kind of help some of these quieter bits not be as quiet and some of the louder bits not be so loud, depending on how you have it set up. So there's a lot of different kind of creative ways that you can use compression in your productions. Right? So you can either use it to even out the performance and make it a little bit more consistent, or you can use it to add some vibes, some character, some cojones, whatever you want to call it, to your different sound sources that you're happen to be compressing. And you can also, again, use it in conjunction with EQ, and you can put the EQ before, you can put the EQ after, and kind of play around with how that all kind of feeds into it. Now, one thing I'm going to do before we get out of here is just kind of go through. This is a stock compressor, and it has your threshold, ratio, attack, and release. These are kind of the four main controls of all compression. There's also stuff like knees and things, and most compressors are also going to have a makeup gain, but the makeup gain is really just to even out the compressor. It's not really affecting the sound. It's just kind of turning the output volume up or down, and you want to kind of, generally speaking, you want to match this output gain to be roughly about the same volume as the loudest parts of this track were before the compression happened. But I do want to touch on just a few different types of compressors that you might see, and we're not going to go into a lot of detail about what these are, but not all compressors are going to look like that, I guess, is my point. And so I just want to give you kind of a few examples. Now, this is an 1176 emulator, and it functions very similar to this compressor here, except with this compressor, you're bringing the threshold down to meet the sound source. With an 1176, it says input output. With this input, this is essentially your threshold, and what you're doing is you're pushing the input to meet a fixed ceiling or fixed threshold. So you're boosting the input into the threshold that's already kind of permanently set, and then you can control the output here. You have your attack and release settings, and then some fixed ratios. So you can't go any lower than a 4 on this particular compressor, but you do have some options here. You can choose between 4, 8, 12, and 20, or you can have all of them pushed in, which gives some fun results as well. So you can use this to give a little bit of distortion to it as well. So without. And then here's your gain reduction. So this is kind of acting as your threshold, but it's just working the opposite way. Instead of bringing the threshold down to meet where the signal is, with this one, you're pushing the signal up to where the threshold is. But it's the same kind of concept, right? Then you have your makeup gain here, or your output. Then you have your attack and release, which you can go, fast, slow, however you want to do it. This is like a medium release. And so with it off, you can really hear that like there's the loud and quiet parts are really apparent. But when it's on, it's really, really minimizing the difference between the quiet and loud parts. And so this is another compressor that exists in the world. And I'm just kind of showing you some examples of other compressors and some of the functions. Let's see. But they're mostly all going to have the same kind of functionality, even if they don't always have the same controls. Like, for instance, this is another emulator of a popular compressor, an LA2A. This one only really has the output gain and then the threshold. So the attack and release are kind of fixed. And with this particular compressor, I think that depending on how much you are lowering the signal or whatever, this will actually increase or decrease the attack and release time dependent on how much signal is being put through here. But you only have a couple of knobs here in order to do the compression, so you don't have control over the attack and release or the ratio or any of that per se. You just have the threshold setting here, or the peak reduction as it's called here, but this is essentially the threshold, and then you have your makeup gain. And then depending on how much you're compressing or not compressing, I think determines on how much the ratio to attack and release are doing in this particular instance. And then you have your gain reduction needle here. Without it. And with it. Yeah, just a little bit more even. And like I said, you can go from subtle to extreme, but with that, so not all compressors, I guess my point when showing you some of these other examples is not all compressors will have every option available to you, but they're all kind of working the same way. They're just automatically turning down the volume based on the settings that you've used with your attack, release, threshold, ratio, etc. Just you won't always have control over every single one of those parameters the same way that you would with this. So like you can dial in an exact ratio, an exact threshold, an exact attack, an exact release, and really have some control over this. Whereas this compressor is still turning down the volume automatically, just like this other compressor. It's a little bit more of a simplified use, and so you're getting a different kind of vibe from it because you can't control every single setting on it. So we can even see what that sounds like on this drum track here. So without it, with it. All right. And so just kind of showing you that there are different types of compressors and they operate in different ways, like whether it's a VCA or an opto or what have you. There are different ways of, but they all do the same thing. Like there are different types of compressors out there. And some people argue that certain compressors are better for certain types of sounds, and there may be some truth to that. But my advice to you would be to kind of play with some of this stuff and just see, what happened. Like, there's so many different types of compressors out there. But at the end of the day, they're all doing the same kind of thing as this compressor is here. They might just do it in different ways or with different controls or in different interfaces but like for instance, with this compressor, here's your, this is a stereo compressor, by the way. So it's like you have your left and your right channel here. There's mono versions of this as well, but you can actually independently compress the left or the right channel depending on how you want the sound to sound. So like here's your threshold for your left and your right. Here's your ratio and then your output gain. So you don't really have any control over your attack and release on this particular compressor, but you do have control over the ratio. And so different compressors are going to have different controls, but they all kind of operate in the same way and will give you similar results depending on how you use them. But yeah, so like you can use them to add vibe, you can use them to control the dynamics or like the performances, make them more even. You can be creative with it or you can be subtle with it, but they exist and they are a tool at your disposal to kind of do with as you please, and you can have some fun with them. Like I said, whether to add vibe or to just kind of control the dynamics a little bit. And a lot of these compressors will have some presets that you can kind of play with as well. So let's see here. Do we have any kind of fun? No. So here's just like a preset that you can kind of choose, and then you can tweak this preset. When it comes to presets on these EQs and compressors, they're a great place to start. Although you may need to make adjustments to them depending on the sound source and things like that. So like just because you're using the preset does not mean it's going to be perfect. Excuse me. That was a yawn. Just because you're using a preset, like for instance, this says room mics. So this is for drum room mics, I would imagine, or just kind of anything, or overheads here, bass guitar, bass drum. There's no setting here for the entire drum kit, so we can just maybe try and do this bass drum thing here, and we'll see what that sounds like. But depending on the sound source, you may have to play with the threshold or the compression or whatever, some of these various controls in order to get the vibe you're going for. So without. And so, depending on what kind of vibe you're going for, you can, use these presets and play with them and see if. And just see where they feel right. You can check this gain reduction, but like you can have some fun with this. My overall point is, don't be afraid to experiment and mess around with the knobs and turn the buttons until you're getting the vibe you want. And knowing the controls and how to go about it is just kind of a way to get there faster. And you can use kind of this guide, if you will, to sort of dial it in a little quicker, maybe. So if you want your sound source to have a softer, more kind of compressed, more pushed back sort of sound, you can use a fast attack. If you want it to sound smooth, contained, and controlled, you can use a slow release. But if you want a punchier, more impactful, more aggressive sound, you can go for a slow attack. If you want explosive, boomy, exciting, or aggressive again, you can go for a fast release. So those are some general guidelines on where to start when it comes to compressing things, and then you can dial it in from there. You can play with things depending on what kind of vibe you want to give your instrumentation, and then you can also pair that in with EQ to really add more character and vibe to your sound. But compression and EQ are tools that are going to really allow you to fine tune and dial in the sound that you really want to give your instrument to have, and allow you to have some kind of fun and creative control over it. So, anyways, I hope this has all been helpful. Next week we are probably going to start diving into more of the I guess what some people would maybe characterize as the fun effects, your reverb, delays, things like that. Stuff that's kind of more icing on the cake rather than the cake itself. With like EQ and compression are like the main ingredients in a cake. Your delays, your reverbs, your modulation effects, things like this, those are going to be the frosting. And some people love the frosting more than they like the cake. So if you're a frosting person, you're going to like what we get into next week, which is probably going to be either delay or reverb. But we'll get into more of that kind of stuff as we go forward. So anyways, I hope this has all been helpful. I hope you have a better understanding of compression and how you can apply it to your own productions, and how to use it to have some kind of creative control over what you are doing with your music. And with that, I hope you have a great day, a great week, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.